They say that revenge doesn't fix anything, that it's just a hollow victory, and you end up feeling worse. But honestly, I don't know if I agree. I cheated on my wife, and I ruined her career. Am I proud of it? Well, maybe more than I should be. It gave me a sense of control, like I'd finally taken back something she'd stolen from me without even realizing it. But before we get into that, let's go back to the beginning. You need to understand how this all started. I'm just a regular guy, a baker, to be specific. It's not glamorous, but it's what I've always loved doing. There's something about working with dough, the way it feels when it's just right, the smell of fresh bread coming out of the oven, it's satisfying. But owning my own bakery? Now, that's a dream I've had for years, but never dared to chase. Too much risk, too much responsibility. It's not just about making bread, There's the money, the staff, the rent, and the fear of failing. The thought of all that kept me from pulling the trigger. So I stayed where I was, working in someone else's shop, doing my thing, and letting the dream of my own place sit on the back burner. My wife, though, she was nothing like me. She was ambitious, always going after the next big thing. One of the directors at some big corporation, one of those jobs where people wear expensive suits and sit in glass-walled offices all day. She managed teams, led projects, whatever. I didn't understand half of what she did, but it paid well. Really well. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. She made more money than me, and that's supposed to bother me, right? But it didn't. At least, not at first. We were different, but I loved her. Back then, I didn't care that she was climbing the corporate ladder while I was covered in flour and sweat, making bread for the local bakery. Her job was demanding, but we found time for each other. I never thought her success would become a problem between us. If anything, I was proud of her. She was a force to be reckoned with, and I admired that. But somewhere along the line, things shifted. It was gradual at first, like a slow drip that eventually becomes a flood. She started staying late at work more often. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her job was important, and I didn't want to be the guy who complained about her working hard. But then came the business trips. There was always another meeting, another conference, another emergency that pulled her away. And when she was home, it felt like she wasn't really here. Physically, sure, but emotionally, she was distant, distracted. I remember the first time I noticed it. We were sitting on the couch, watching some movie. I don't even remember what it was. But instead of cuddling up next to me like she used to, she was glued to her phone, barely paying attention to what was happening on the screen. I tried to talk to her, ask about her day, but she gave me these one-word answers, like I was an afterthought. Something in the pit of my stomach twisted, but I brushed it off. She was just tired, I told myself. Stress from work. Nothing more. But it didn't stop. It got worse. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd snap at me, telling me she was too tired to talk. Or she'd come home hours late, reeking of some perfume that wasn't hers, with barely an explanation. I wanted to confront her, but I didn't. Why? Because her job was important. She was the breadwinner, the one bringing in the real money. How could I accuse her of anything when she was the one paying most of the bills? So, I swallowed my suspicions and stayed quiet. But deep down, I knew. You can only ignore that gut feeling for so long before it starts eating away at you. And by the time I finally admitted to myself that something was wrong, I realized I didn't even know who she was anymore. Then, one night, or early morning, really, everything came crashing down. It was around 3 a.m., and I was half asleep. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, loud enough to wake me. Normally, I wouldn't have paid it any mind, but this time, something made me look. I reached over and glanced at the screen. There was a text message. The screen lit up just enough for me to see it. A heart emoji from a name I didn't recognize, but the message preview showed enough. Can't wait to see you again. I froze. My first thought was that I must be dreaming. This couldn't be real. But there it was, staring back at me, clear as day. My heart started pounding in my chest, so loud I swear I could hear it. I reached for her phone. My hand was shaking, but I had to know. I had to see the rest of that message, to see what she was hiding. I tried to unlock it, but guess what? The password had been changed. Changed. I couldn't believe it. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't a mistake. She had something to hide, and I just stumbled onto it. I sat there in the dark, her phone still in my hand, my mind racing. I could hear her soft breathing next to me, completely unaware that her whole world was about to fall apart. That was the moment everything clicked. The late nights, the business trips, the distance, it all made sense now. And I knew right then and there that I wasn't just going to let this slide. Revenge doesn't fix anything, they say. But I was about to find out for myself just how sweet it could be. The next morning, I couldn't shake what I'd seen. That heart emoji, the message, it had all been too real to ignore. I didn't sleep much after that. And when my wife finally stirred awake, I was ready. I waited until she was up, brushing her hair in the bathroom mirror, before I said anything. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't let it slide. Hey, I saw something weird on your phone last night, I said, trying to sound casual, like I wasn't already jumping to conclusions. She looked at me in the mirror, her expression blank. What do you mean? She asked, not stopping what she was doing. There was a text, at 3 a.m, from someone with a heart emoji. I watched her reaction carefully, waiting for that flicker of guilt, the little crack in her calm. But nothing. She just blinked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. A heart emoji? She repeated, her voice flat. Yeah, heart. From one of your coworkers, I think. Can I see your phone? She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Then, without a word, she unlocked her phone and handed it to me. I hesitated for a second, wondering if she was going to pull it away last minute, but she didn't. So I opened her messages, scrolling to the chat I'd seen in the middle of the night. Nothing. It was completely empty. I frowned, checking again, my thumb scrolling faster. Where was it? I was sure of what I'd seen. I looked up at her, and she raised an eyebrow, all calm and collected. Maybe someone sent it by mistake and deleted it afterward, she shrugged. You know how people do that sometimes, right? Realize they've sent something to the wrong person, and poof, gone. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile you give someone when they've said something stupid, and you're just humoring them. Happens to everyone. She made me feel like a complete idiot, like I was some paranoid fool, overreacting to nothing. I opened my mouth to argue, but then closed it again. What could I even say? The message was gone, and there was nothing to prove what I'd seen. She took her phone back and slipped it into her bag, all while giving me this look like I was wasting her time. Anything else? Or are we done here? I need to get to work. I shook my head, feeling like I'd just lost some invisible battle. No, that's it. Good. She kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened and walked out the door. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what just happened. Maybe she was right. Maybe someone did send the message by mistake and deleted it. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there, but something still didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that she was playing me somehow. But I buried it. Maybe I was being paranoid. Later that day, I figured I owed her an apology. After all, I'd come at her first thing in the morning with accusations, and she'd been calm, even reasonable about it. Maybe I was being too suspicious. So, I texted her and asked if she wanted to go out for dinner somewhere nice. My way of saying sorry without actually having to say it. Her reply came back quick. I can't. I've got too much work tonight. Maybe another time. I didn't think much of it. She worked late all the time. This was nothing new. I told her we'd plan something for the weekend instead. But by the evening, I was feeling down. There was still this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. So I decided to go for a walk, clear my head. I wandered around for a while just trying to get my thoughts together. My wife hadn't come home yet. She'd told me she was still working, and I believed her. I mean, why wouldn't I? But then, as I walked past one of the nicer restaurants downtown, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There she was, my wife, sitting at a table, smiling, laughing. And right across from her was one of her colleagues, another director from her company, a guy I'd met maybe once or twice. They looked cozy. Too cozy for a work dinner. I stood there, frozen on the sidewalk, staring through the glass like some kind of idiot. My heart started racing again, that same thumping in my chest from the night before. My brain was working overtime, trying to come up with an explanation, something that made sense. I mean, she had said she was working late. Maybe this was part of it? A work meeting? I pulled out my phone and called her. It rang twice before she picked up. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, like I wasn't standing right outside the restaurant where I could see her. "Where are you?" "I'm still at work," she said casually, like she wasn't lying through her teeth. "Just having dinner with some colleagues, discussing a few work things." "Why?" I clenched my teeth. "Just checking. You're sure it's just work?" Her voice hardened. "Jesus. Why are you always so suspicious lately? I told you I'm just having dinner with colleagues. You really need to calm down. You're starting to sound paranoid." I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Was I being too much? Maybe I was blowing this out of proportion. Maybe I was just insecure, and it was showing. "Sorry," I muttered. "I didn't mean to." "No, you did. You're getting way too friendly with your suspicions. Look, I got work to do, okay? Stop calling me every 5 minutes like some needy teenager." And with that, she hung up. I stood there for a minute, staring at my phone, feeling like I'd just been slapped. I looked back through the window at her and her colleague. They were still chatting, still smiling. And for a second, I actually felt guilty. Guilty for thinking she might be cheating, for suspecting her in the first place. I mean, she was right, wasn't she? I was probably seeing things that weren't there. Work dinners happen all the time. I was being paranoid. I was the one making things worse. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and walked home with my head down. But I was so wrong. So wrong. A couple of weeks after that night, my wife told me about this mini corporate party her company was hosting. It wasn't a huge deal, just a little Friday night gathering with her colleagues. The kind of thing I typically avoided like the plague. I never liked corporate events. Too many people I couldn't relate to, all pretending to enjoy themselves while talking about work. But this time I felt like I had to go. After the restaurant incident and all those suspicions swirling in my head, guilt had been gnawing at me. Maybe I was the problem, being too paranoid and jumping to conclusions. So I agreed to go. I figured showing up might make things better, smooth things over. Meanwhile, work had been going pretty well. There was this new girl who joined us recently. She was bright, cheerful, always had a smile on her face. I found myself chatting with her often. It wasn't anything inappropriate, just easy. She was fun to talk to, and we clicked in a way that I hadn't experienced in a while. She didn't know I was married, though, and I never brought it up. I work without my ring because it gets in the way, and it never came up in conversation. I guess part of me enjoyed that, being seen as just me, not the married guy. But she's not really a big part of the story. Not yet, at least. Let's get back to that party. It was a Friday night, and we arrived separately. She had left work early to help set things up, while I finished a shift at the bakery and showed up a little late. The party was in full swing by the time I got there. People mingling, drinks flowing, music in the background. For the first hour or so, everything seemed fine. We didn't cling to each other. She was off chatting with her coworkers, and I was at the bar trying to make small talk with a couple of people I barely knew. I wasn't exactly having a blast, but it wasn't miserable either. I figured if I could just make it through the night without causing any waves, I'd consider it a win. Then, at some point, I noticed her across the room. She was standing with that same colleague, the one I'd seen her having dinner with at the restaurant. The sight of them together set off alarms in my head. I watched them for a minute, the way they were standing close, talking quietly like they had something to hide. That familiar knot formed in my stomach again, and I knew I had to get closer. I wasn't going to confront her. No, that would be too obvious. But I wanted to hear what they were talking about. I needed to know if my suspicions were real or just the product of my overactive imagination. It wasn't hard to get close without being noticed. The party was crowded, and people were moving around constantly. I just drifted through the sea of bodies, keeping my eyes on them, making sure to stay out of sight. When I got close enough, I stopped and listened. And that's when I heard it. The words that changed everything. "You really need to leave him," her colleague said, his voice low but clear enough for me to catch every word. "It's time. You deserve better than this. Kick him out of the house. Make it official. And we can finally be together without hiding." My blood ran cold. I stood there frozen, my mind spinning. My wife didn't say anything at first, just nodded like she'd been thinking the same thing all along. And then, in a voice that was somehow even colder than his, she said, "I know. It's just the timing. I need to make sure everything is set before I make my move." Make her move. Like I was some kind of pawn in her little game, something to be discarded when it suited her. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, that old familiar thump, 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 but this time there was no guilt. Just anger. White-hot anger. My suspicions weren't just suspicions anymore. They were planning this, plotting how to get rid of me so they could parade around together without any shame. And all this time, she'd been treating me like I was the one with the problem, making me feel like a fool while she was stabbing me in the back. But I didn't confront them. Not yet. I stood there still as a statue, watching them, listening. If they were making plans in secret, then so would I. There was no point in blowing up right then and there. No. If they thought they could quietly make their little escape, I was going to show them just how wrong they were. So I backed away, slipped back into the crowd, and left the party early. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just walked out the door and started planning my next move. After that night at the party, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd overheard. My wife and her colleague plotting to throw me out of my own house like I was nothing. The anger simmered, but I knew I had to be smart. Blowing up in the moment wouldn't do me any good. No, if I was going to get my revenge, I needed to hit her where it would really hurt. Her career. I spent days thinking it over, running through different ideas in my head. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her and her slimy colleague ride off into the sunset together while I was left to pick up the pieces. I wanted to make sure she lost everything the same way she was planning for me. That's when the plan started to take shape. I knew about a competitor of her company, one that had been vying for market share for a while. They were always trying to outmaneuver her corporation, but they never quite succeeded. I figured if I could get them some inside information, some sensitive work data, it would be enough to destabilize her company and her position. But how was I going to do it? I couldn't access her phone. She was too careful with it ever since she changed the password. But her laptop? That was a different story. She often worked from home, but on weekends, she barely touched the thing. It sat in our living room, closed and ignored. I'd seen her using it enough times to know it held everything. Her emails, files, presentations, everything I needed to ruin her. I just had to get my hands on it without her noticing. I waited for the right moment, biding my time. Then, one weekend, the perfect opportunity presented itself. We were having one of those typical lazy Saturdays. She was lounging around, flipping through her phone, and I casually mentioned that I had to go away for business. I didn't make a big deal out of it, just a simple, "Hey, I gotta head out for a work thing. I'll be back tomorrow." She didn't even blink. "Okay, cool," she said, barely looking up from whatever Instagram feed she was scrolling through. No questions, no objections, just indifference. And honestly, that made it easier. She didn't care where I was going or what I was doing. She was so wrapped up in her own world that she didn't even notice me packing up my stuff. But what she didn't see was that I slipped her laptop into my backpack along with my clothes. Like I said, she never touched the damn thing on weekends, so I knew she wouldn't miss it for a day. I headed out of the house, and as soon as I was in the car, I drove straight to a service center. I wasn't a tech expert, so I needed someone to help me with the next part of my plan. I told the guy at the center that I needed a backup of everything on the laptop. Work files, emails, everything. He didn't ask any questions, didn't even blink at the request. After all, I was the one paying, and as far as he was concerned, I owned the laptop. An hour later, I had a copy of everything. All her work emails, confidential files, sensitive documents, The kind of stuff that would make her corporation sweat if it ever landed in the wrong hands. Exactly what I needed. I didn't bother going through the files myself. I didn't care if there were any personal messages or private details. That wasn't my focus. All I wanted was the information that could cripple her career. Once I had everything, I drove back home like nothing had happened. The laptop went right back where I'd found it, perfectly untouched. She was still lying around, oblivious to the fact that her entire professional life was now in my hands. I kissed her on the forehead like it was just another day and went about my evening, pretending everything was normal. But inside, I was buzzing. I had the power now. She didn't know it, but I was already one step ahead of her. While she was busy plotting her escape with that colleague of hers, I was putting together my own plan. The question now was, how exactly was I going to play my hand? After hearing that conversation at the party, I couldn't stop thinking about what my next move should be. Destroying her career. That was the goal. But I had to be smart about it. No one could trace it back to me, and it had to hurt her in a way that would ripple through her life. It took time, but eventually, I found the perfect target. A guy from one of her company's biggest competitors. He wasn't a top executive or anything like that, but he was connected enough to make things happen. It was clear his company was hungry for an edge, something that would give them a leg up, and I had just the thing, inside information straight from her laptop. I made contact with him discreetly, not wanting to tip my hand too early. When we finally spoke, I didn't beat around the bush. I offered him confidential files, the kind that could shake things up at her corporation. I wasn't giving it away for free, though. I named my price, and it was a hefty one. Let's just say it was more than enough to set me up nicely once everything went down. At first, he balked. He said it was too risky, that he couldn't just hand over that kind of money without knowing if the data was real. I expected that, so I agreed to let him check it out first. But there was no way I was going to risk revealing who I was. I had to make sure this deal stayed clean and anonymous. That's why I kept it simple. I wore a protective mask, nothing too flashy, just enough to make sure I wouldn't be recognized. We agreed to meet in a deserted parking lot in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place that felt like something out of a bad crime movie. I showed up with a portable hard drive tucked into my jacket, and the guy was already waiting, leaning against his car, looking nervous. He plugged the drive in his laptop right there and started scrolling through the files. I stood back, my heart hammering in my chest. Each minute felt like an hour as I watched him, his face lit up by the screen. He barely said a word, just kept clicking, skimming through her emails, confidential reports, financial data, everything that could sink her and her company. It must have been at least half an hour before he finally looked up at me, and I saw the gleam in his eyes. "This is good," he said. "It's worth the money." I nodded, but I wasn't done. "There's one more condition," I said, keeping my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that. "What is it?" "When this blows up, and trust me, it will, I want the story to be that my wife leaked the data. She's the one who gave it to you. Got it?" He paused for a second, probably weighing the consequences, but then he shrugged. "Fine, no skin off my back." To make it even more personal, I handed him a matchbook with her name and surname written on it. It was a symbolic gesture, but it got the message across. When this scandal hit, she was going to take the fall for it, and no one would even suspect I was behind it all. We exchanged the money, cash, of course. I felt the weight of the bills in my hand and knew this was only the beginning. I walked away from that parking lot with my head held high, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing that her world was about to collapse, just like she had planned to do to mine. When I got home, I hid the money in a place she would never think to look. She was too distracted with her phone to even notice I'd been gone. Probably some work drama, though I had no idea just how bad things were about to get for her. The next morning, everything felt normal on the surface. I went to work as if nothing had happened, but inside, I was a different man. I was in control, and that day, for the first time in a while, I actually felt good. I talked a lot with the new girl at work. She was bright, full of energy, the kind of person who made everything feel lighter. We joked about the little things, and it felt easy, effortless, like I didn't have to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders for a few hours. At the end of the day, she turned to me and asked, "Hey, do you want to grab a coffee after work?" I hesitated for just a second, but then I thought, why not? I needed a distraction, something to take my mind off the storm that was brewing at home. So I said yes. We ended up in this small, cozy cafe not far from work, the kind of place that was perfect for just unwinding. We drank coffee, laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was just me again. No drama, no betrayal, just two people enjoying each other's company. As we finished up, she asked if I'd walk her home. I agreed. And as we walked through the cool evening streets, the conversation turned quieter, more personal. When we got to her place, she stopped and turned to me. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her eyes holding a question I knew too well. I hesitated. This was a line I hadn't crossed before, not even after everything my wife had done. But there was something about the moment that felt inevitable, like it had been leading up to this all along. I couldn't dodge it anymore. So, instead of just walking in, I stopped and told her the truth. "I need to tell you something first," I said, my voice low. "I'm married." She blinked, clearly surprised, but she didn't say anything. I told her everything. The whole story, my wife, her affair, the betrayal, the revenge I'd set in motion. I didn't leave anything out. I half expected her to throw me out, to tell me to leave. But instead, she just nodded, processing it all. After a long pause, she got up and went to the kitchen. When she came back, she had a bottle of whiskey in her hand. "Whiskey?" I asked, surprised. "I thought you liked wine." She gave me a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. After hearing that story, wine's not going to cut it. We drank in silence for a while, and at some point, the distance between us just disappeared. I don't even remember how it happened, but the next thing I knew, we were in bed together. It wasn't planned, but it felt inevitable. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. And honestly, I didn't even feel guilty about it. My wife didn't call, didn't text. She had bigger problems on her hands. Work was blowing up, and the fallout was just beginning. She didn't have time to wonder where I was, and that suited me just fine. When I finally went home after staying with my colleague, I knew it was time to face the music. Things had been unraveling for a while, but this felt like the breaking point. I walked through the door, half expecting to see her already packing her things, or maybe pretending like everything was fine. But no, she was waiting for me. The second I stepped inside, she let loose. "You ruined everything," she screamed, her face twisted with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done? My career is over. I'm a joke at work, and it's all because of you." I just stood there, letting her words wash over me. There was no point in arguing, no point in trying to defend myself. She was spiraling, and I wasn't about to waste my breath pretending like I cared about her corporate ladder anymore. She went on, her voice rising with each sentence. "You've always been nothing, just a damn Nevadan who hasn't achieved anything in life. And now you've dragged me down with you. You've destroyed everything I built." That one stung. I'm not going to lie. I'd never been one to boast about achievements or status, but hearing it from her like that, like I was just some failure who had never amounted to anything, it hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. Maybe because a part of me still cared, even though I knew it was over. I clenched my fist but stayed calm. There was no point in fighting her rage with more anger. Instead, I took a deep breath and said the words I'd been holding back for too long. "I think it's time we get a divorce." She froze for a second, probably surprised that I'd said it out loud. Then she laughed, this cold, bitter laugh that made my skin crawl. "A divorce? Oh, that's rich. You think you could just walk away from this after everything you've done?" I nodded. "Yeah, I do. Because I'm done. Done with all of it." For the first time that night, there was silence. She stood there, glaring at me, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. The room felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out of it. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how to respond. But there was nothing left to say. We both knew it was over. She stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there in the middle of our broken home. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. The decision was made. After that night, things moved quickly. We started the divorce process, and surprisingly, there wasn't much to fight over. She was too busy trying to salvage what was left of her career, and I was too tired to care about anything but getting out. But while the dust settled on my marriage, something else was starting to bloom. I kept seeing my colleague, the same one I'd spent that night with. Things between us felt natural, easy. We weren't rushing into anything, but it was clear we had something good going on. It was the kind of relationship that didn't feel like work, which was a nice change of pace after the constant tension at home. And with the money I'd made from selling the information, I finally did something I'd always been too scared to do. I bought the bakery where I'd been working. It was mine now. No more clocking in for someone else. No more fear of failing. I owned it and it felt damn good. Life was starting to look up. My new relationship was great. We laughed, we enjoyed each other's company. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on solid ground. I had my own business, and I wasn't tied down by the past anymore. My wife's words about me being a Nevadan who hadn't achieved anything echoed in my mind sometimes, but now they felt empty. I'd achieved more than she ever realized, more than I'd even realized. As for her, I didn't keep track of how her downfall played out. I heard through the grapevine that things were getting worse at work, but I didn't care enough to dig into the details. She was dealing with the fallout of her own decisions, and I had my own life to focus on. Update. It's been a year since everything went down, and I figured it was time to give an update. A lot has changed since I last shared my story, and honestly, I never thought I'd be in the place I am today. First off, I'm married now. Yeah, I know, crazy, right? After everything that happened, I didn't think I'd ever want to walk down that road again, but life has a funny way of surprising you. I ended up marrying the colleague I told you about, the one who stood by me when everything else was falling apart. She's been a rock, and I couldn't ask for a better partner. And get this, she's pregnant. We found out a few months ago, and now we're getting ready to welcome a baby into our lives. It still feels surreal, like I'm living someone else's story, but every day it gets more real. I'm excited and nervous all at once, but mostly, I'm just grateful. As for the bakery, it's doing better than I could have imagined. After buying it, I poured everything I had into making it work, and it paid off. Business is thriving, and I've even had to hire a few extra hands to keep up with demand. It's still hard work, but it's the kind of work that feels worth it, you know? I wake up every morning knowing I'm building something for myself, something real. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. A year ago, my life was in shambles, and now, well, I'm in a much better place. I've let go of the anger, the hurt, and all the baggage that came with my ex. She's out of my life, and I've moved on completely. I just want to thank everyone who followed along with my story, who offered support, advice, or even just kind words. You have no idea how much it helped, especially during the tough times. Reading your comments, seeing that people cared, it made a difference. So, thanks for being there. I appreciate all of you more than you know. Here's to new beginnings, better days, and the future ahead.